I think just to understand why, I think for a lot of people, they might not understand why a PMS company is talking about payments and why it devotes so much time thinking about it and talking about it. And I think it basically just goes back to the origins of Mews basically starting out in the hotel in Prague, which is the hotel emblem. The problem that I was basically trying to solve there is how to make sure that everyone who comes in doesn't have to have that boring conversation about, give me your credit card, give me your personal details, all of those things. And it basically, and the reason why we actually started building a PMS in the first place was because we found that with the existing providers, we couldn't solve that problem. And the main bottleneck was payments. And I think for me, I think fintech and payments in general is just such an incredibly exciting space. And you have some of the greatest minds coming from that. I mean, for example, Jens, who you just saw, he was Chief Strategy Officer at Untitled before, and that's why I'm so excited to actually have these two fine gentlemen here, because they do work for two of, I think, the kinds of companies that we look to kind of think of when we think of great technology, great execution, great way to service clients. So I think first of all with Stripe, we really wanted to work with them, I think, pretty much from day one of Mews, and they only moved to Europe a few years ago. Weirdly enough, even though they were founded by two Irish brothers, I think they're now at a valuation of the last round of something like 5.2 billion, a bit higher. Sorry, I've got old information there, but it's an incredible platform, and that's really helping us trying to actually innovate our product. And then on the other side, there's Untitled that you might have seen in the news recently. They were acquired by eBay for an enormous 2.2 billion. Sorry, PayPal. Sorry, God. Yeah, I should get that right. And really, you see them now pretty much in the UK on every single street corner. You see their terminals, you see their wares there, and I think, for me personally, they've really kind of introduced a completely new way of actually kind of shopping and going to certain markets and things like that. So I guess I'll sit down and I guess I wanted the first kind of question to kind of start off with and kick us off with is I guess try and explain the kind of the state of play. What do you think is innovative within payments, and what is right now basically the things that particularly excite you about the products that you guys are bringing out, and that you're excited about the payment space?
You want me to go first?
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, can I ask you a question? Where can I get a pair of those shoes?
So, actually eBay.
I just saw you plugging in your shoes over there.
Yeah,
Can you make calls on those as well? Or?
Yeah, I was charging my shoes. I think would everyone charge their shoes today, right? Yeah, that's the main thing.
Sorry, I distracted us. What's going on in payments? The things that are, there's kind of a few themes going on, I think, in payments generally. I think it's probably fair to say in most industries, certainly not just hospitality, that it's one of those sectors where, the technology has probably not really kept pace with, historically with kind of consumer demand and kind of the motion of the industry and so on. So I think there's interesting things going on in payments, particularly in hospitality, that we've started to see in other sectors as well. And they're things like, to use the cliche, kind of the Uber-style experience of payments, invisible payments where, you only ask your client or your customer once for their payment credentials, and then irrespective of kind of how they engage with you across channels, whether it's, online for the booking or at checkout, in the hotel or the property or the accommodation type, that, that the payments are not intrusive for them. And so I think we've taken a lot of cues from what's gone on in the kind of the pure online world there, and are starting to see some of that nicely now translate more to the offline world also. And guys like Untitled have definitely got a kind of a lot to be kind of proud of in that space as well. The way they've kind of enhanced that kind of what we would call the card present environment. I think the other thing that's going on from our perspective that's really exciting is just what's going on in the world of kind of what we term platforms and marketplaces. And this is a space that's obviously very relevant and familiar to you guys, but it's going on kind of everywhere. There is a marketplace, something that connects buyers and sellers of goods and services in pretty much every kind of industry sector at the moment. And I think actually that's where we're starting to see a lot of the innovation going on in spaces like, well, if companies and then the underlying payments technology that supports them needs to be kind of truly global because the consumers are global, then not only does the technology need to operate on a global basis, but it also needs to be very localized. It needs to be the right payment method, the right currency, via the right channel for whatever the kind of the quirks or nuances of a consumer in a certain country might be. And so we're very excited about everything that's going on there in terms of how API-based technologies are allowing merchants or platforms or properties or retailers to really not be concerned about the complexity of how you bring all of those payment methods and instruments to market, but just by virtue of the fact that you can now offer whatever the consumer needs to take friction out of the payment process. There's lots of other things as well, but they're probably the two headlines from our perspective.
So what about you?
Great. Also great to be here, by the way. Incredible setting.
Isn't it?
Yeah. I'll try to speak the truth. I think the big thing that interests us is inclusiveness and accessibility. And there's this notion that now you have, in your mobile phone, you have the power of a bank branch right there. So historically, where you would have had to visit a bank branch and go through the kind of processes associated with bank branches, you can now access payment-related services and a bunch of other things through your mobile phone, and get going with that process very fast. And then I would say the other thing that kind of is married to that is exactly what Ian has talked about, which is the software or the platform that sits around the payment experience that is the driving decision maker in terms of what the user of the payment experience will choose. It's the platform that wins the payment conversation, and we think that's a great thing. It's the value-added services that sit around payment that should determine the choice of the merchant. Payment ultimately is something that you want to be invisible. You want it to be invisible as a consumer, and you really want it to be invisible as a merchant so that it doesn't get in the way of the consumer's efforts to pay. And so that's something that platforms enable, really, is that they tend to be the ones that drive the decision. Am I going to use Stripe? Maybe a decision that gets driven by, am I going to use Mews? Right? And so I think we welcome that, because then it means you have to have the right partnerships with the right platforms.
Nice. Yeah, I think that kind of leads into the second thing that I wanted to say is, to kind of lead into is, I think a lot of the times, even today, people have been talking about the Uberization of that experience. And, to me, it'll happen now that I'll just go into a taxi and just walk out without paying. And that if that's a black cab, the guy's like, "Oi, come back." But I think it becomes so natural and so embedded so quickly. And I find myself, I'm just like, Uber wasn't around a couple of years ago. And I think that's really, really interesting to see how payments in that kind of way, even though you don't think of it almost as payments, but it's changing that, the context of the customer journey as well. And I think, I think you guys especially, I'll start the other way, but at IZET will think about it really, really interestingly, I think from, the point of, where do you take payment and how do you take payment as well.
Yeah, and I think the Uber example is great because it shows you how key a decision-making driver payments is. There's the convenience of Uber and the speed to get an Uber taxi, but actually how much does that compare with a black cab in London? Actually, often you can get a black cab faster. And payments, the fact that you don't have to use cash, that there isn't that hassle, drives decision-making. So that's applies to so many different situations. I think the removal of friction there is happening in other areas in not quite the same form. So I think contactless payment is a very obvious case where, you might find that you do business where you otherwise wouldn't because you accept a contactless form of payment. We're having a kind of experiment at the moment in London, which we're working on with London buskers, where we thought, great, let's equip London buskers with a contactless card terminal. It's going to be amazing because they suffer from the depreciating value of change and the fact that people don't carry change anymore. And it was great until we found out the obvious, which was that they're playing their music and someone wants to pay them, and then they have to stop, and they have to sort of, type the amount into the machine. So then we've introduced a feature called repeat payments, which allows the customer the machine to reset itself to £2, so that the commuter can kind of tap out with his Oyster and tap out to donate for the busker. So it's those kind of removals of friction. It's not just Uber's an example, but they're happening all over the place. And then I would say the theme that you were picking up on at the end there is, I guess, a shift in the concept of point of sale. So point of sale, historically has been based on, the sort of administrative need to manage a point of sale, but also determined by the friction that comes with having to have a big fat computer on your desk to manage a transaction. Given with mobility more and more in place, point of sale starts to sort of shift to being where the customer wants it to be. So in the case of booking, obviously, you have lots of mobility in and around booking, but I think that's just one part of a hotel's inventory. You have all of the inventory connected with your food and your beverages that you supply, and you have the inventory connected with other services like massage and so on that might take place in your establishments. There, I think, the digitalization of that inventory, the fact that it sits in the cloud, can enable lots of different interactions that don't take place at your cashier desk in the front of your hotel. So the obvious ones would be, using a mobile device to connect with your cloud point of sale in your restaurant to order something to my room, or using my mobile device to order a service like a massage and have payment as part of that experience. And there you see point of sale shifted from the checkout environment to where I want to pay as a consumer. And I think that's a trend.
I guess I'd probably add to that, I think the consumer theme is the main one here, around kind of frictionless choice and so on. And I think from the kind of the merchant side of that equation, I think kind of customization is also a pretty key word there, i.e. it's not one size fits all, depending on whether it's your definition of point of sale versus the industry you're in, or the nature of the good or service you're selling. And I think the other thing that kind of payments tech generally is doing an increasingly good job of is kind of putting that modularity and ability to kind of customize what that consumer checkout and flow experience might look like in a way that's kind of fit for purpose, for the particular example. And I think online payments has probably led the charge on that in kind of most recent years. But again, we're starting to see that kind of translate, into the kind of the offline point of sale or card present world as well, by equipping businesses with kind of, the component parts to kind of assemble them, with SDKs, and obviously mobile is playing, kind of a key role here, so that the simplicity and the customization that might be required in the offline card present or physical payment instrument present world is just as customizable and as it is in the online world. And we've seen that as being a huge driver, over the last kind of 7 years in terms of payment conversion in the online world. And we think there's plenty of opportunities, to do more and more of that in the, irrespective of the channel, including offline.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think it also touches upon one thing, which is, we talk so much about personalization from the consumer perspective, but I think both of your examples actually kind of, there's so much that's happening with the kind of the personalization almost of the merchant experience, basically, that, the busker example, you could flip that to a hotel and basically say, that is one experience that, let's say, a merchant is doing within a certain kind of context. And I think that's really, really interesting. And I think, to lead it back to the previous example of when Eric was talking about these kind of great initiatives that you can take within your hotel and this kind of stories that you can weave together. And I think that's essentially what it kind of comes down to. A person isn't traveling to your hotel and to your destination to actually get I think a kind of just a room. They're looking for that kind of experience. And I think that's the most exciting thing that I think the technologies enable, is this kind of new way of actually building in experiences much more into the.
I think that's one of the reasons for that is it is a differentiator for merchants. You know, if you've got multiple competing, you know, to stick with the Uber theme, ride-sharing services, well, actually, you know, the way in which each of those companies can build a different and better and dynamic user experience, that's a core differentiator. I mean, the example that you gave of, you know, the black cab versus, you know, is a good example of that. I think the other thing that's really important to consider there is, you know, in the world of kind of platforms, is that where there are potentially multiple competing platforms competing on the supply side of a marketplace, i.e. the sellers or the providers of services, well, actually, you know, the research that we've done says that for every, you know, 1% kind of increase in seller retention that you can drive will have 10 times more revenue positive impact than a corresponding 1% increase in buyer retention. So actually the customization then for a platform starts to extend to the, well, what choices and options can you give to the providers of services that are operating across your platform? And that's you know, a game changer.
Yeah, exactly. And what actionable insights can you build around that, right? So there's the delivery of the experience that works functionally for the merchant. And then there's all of the insights that come from the convergence of the payments data and your SKU data, your inventory data, what you're selling, whether it's the rooms or your food and beverage or your other services. You know, that's where, you know, payments and the sort of software that sits around those industry, that's becoming more and more one thing, which is the platform you use to run your business. And it should be managing your workflows in and around your consumers, but also helping you optimize and get better and better at what you do and how you provide those services.
Yeah, I think actually the platform idea, because I think a lot of people probably in the room think of platforms as what we do. But I think, you know, if you think of the actual word and where it comes from, all of your properties are platforms. All of your guests are basically sitting on your platforms. And that I think is the main kind of mind shift that I think a lot of hotels need to have, is every single guest that's come from Booking.com or Expedia or wherever they've actually come from, they've come to your platform. And your responsibility, much in the same way that, you know, Stripe tries to make a supplier or somebody who's on their platform happy with their services, and the way that you approach the customer service, the way that iZettle will think of, you know, how can we actually enable this particular restaurant or bar or even a kind of, or just a stand to kind of really, really enable that kind of experience. I think there's so much for us. We at Mews have definitely learned from that kind of customer-centric approach. And I think that is something that's driving a lot of this. And I think that's one of the major shifts that should happen within hotels, to think of themselves as platforms as well, platforms for these types of experiences. And I think
with previously siloed data coming together, right? And so that's the point.
Exactly, yeah.
Previously, your food and beverage would probably sit in a different domain than your bookings. And that doesn't allow you to leave, you know, the customer's favorite choice of drink in the fridge when they arrive the next time, because you haven't linked those two bits of data. And it's like that convergence is exactly the platform point.
Yeah, like I might be getting ahead of myself, but like one of the things that I love to see within you know, platforms and companies like yours is, you know, just, you know, you're starting out with an amazing product and you're kind of going down that kind of rabbit hole of essentially banking services, funding services, all of these kind of different things, because you're essentially trying to solve more and more problems for your users. And I think when we chatted on the phone before, when we were getting prepared, the iZettle funding scheme essentially I thought was really, really interesting as well. Maybe you can just...
Yeah, I think, well, payments companies have an inherent relationship to funding, I think, because of two things. One is they manage financial flows, inevitably, because they manage financial flows from the consumer to the merchant. And then they also have access to a ton of data. And so there are incredibly powerful, kind of not very well named services like merchant cash advance, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's actually it's actually
future.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to come up with these things that resonate, but the experience is actually very simple to explain. When I take payment as a hotelier, I take the payment from the consumer, it is deposited into my account. There is a service which says, well, hey, you've done, you know, in the last 4 months, you've taken this amount into your account. How about we deposit the next 4 months of your takings into your account tomorrow with a click of a few buttons. That is, again, a very different experience from going to your bank branch with your bank statements and having a chat about a loan. And that comes off the back of, digitalization of payments and opening up new services off the back of access to that data. So that, those services are out there today, and they're not very well known.
I think that relates to Stripe. I mean, the way that we use Stripe and cooperate with you guys is through the Connect platform, because I mean, Stripe basically started out as a service for developers, and it was essentially for when a developer wanted to get paid, it was incredibly difficult, and it was incredibly difficult to try and figure this out all on your own. And I think that is one of the things where what we were thinking of is, we do not want to touch the credit cards. We don't want to take on that kind of risk, which traditionally PMSs have kind of done. So we just thought, why don't we find great partners who are specialists in this field, who will keep all of the credit cards safe for the customers? Because if you look at the BA hack, if you look at the what went on with all of the major chains, essentially, you've got Starwood, Mandarin Oriental, these huge hacks of a lot of data being stolen away. I think that's the other part to a lot of this innovation is actually the innovation of security, and the fact that this kind of contextualization can actually really help drive a lot of security. And I think that's one of the things that I love about the Stripe platform, and especially about great products within that, like Radar. And I think it'll be better for you to explain.
You're doing actually a very good job, Richard. So, look, I think that the premise of Stripe, and as you say, we were founded by two Irish brothers, and their goal was to, the slightly techie terminology we use is to abstract away the complexity of payments. When I think about that and try to articulate, I think that kind of comes in lots of layers. One of those is simply, how does someone who's trying to run a business and take payments from their customers, how do they get their head around all of the different pieces of financial infrastructure and payment methods that they might have to connect to? So at one layer, we get rid of that. I think security is another kind of, I think of that of a layer of complexity that, frankly, you guys, your customers don't want to be in the business of having to worry about, especially when it comes to kind of payment data, because as you say, BA are not enjoying the headlines that they've had, recently as a result of that. And so I think taking away just some of that inherent, PCI certification and making sure that people aren't handling kind of raw credit card numbers and details. The technology exists such that nobody other than a payments company should be having to think about kind of dealing with that and kind of managing the complexity and, as you say, the risk that comes with that, because that's what we do for a living. I think the other aspect of security that is inseparable from that is that of fraud. It is the scourge of the payments industry for sure. And again, having to think about how to deal with that when it's not your core business is just something that consumes kind of a lot of resources. And so when you're a technology-oriented company and you can bring to bear, machine learning models to that can operate at gigantic global scale to say, right, the first time that, any given merchant presents a credit card from one of their customers for the first time, there's an 86% chance that we'll have seen that exact credit card somewhere on the Stripe network, somewhere in the world before, and we can take a couple of hundred signals like, when did we last see it? Where did we last see it? What did it buy? How frequently has it been used? All the way down to how long did the person that last used that credit card spend on the web page where they used it before they actually entered their card details, because all of these signals are very sophisticated means for identifying hacks and fraud. So as you say, we built some technology to manage that risk for ourselves, first of all, and thought, hey, wouldn't this be a good idea if we turned this into a product and made it available to our customers as well? And so that culminated in something called Radar, as you mentioned, which is, again, it's an inherent part of the payments platform, because the payments data is what allows you to do that with high fidelity.
Yeah. I think it's kind of pretty amazing to hear about Radar and then remind ourselves of the world we live in, because we're still in a world, we're sort of blinded by habit of this practice that I'm sure maybe people in the audience have, which is easy to sort of overlook. But not only do we live in a world of radar, that's, you know, kind of supernova technology, but there's the everyday thing that we know about, which is putting your card into a chip and pin terminal and making sure it's encrypted and all that kind of stuff. But in that same world, we live in a world where you can call up, you know, a hotel and say, I want to book a room, and they can say, okay, can you give me your 16-digit card number, please? And I also wouldn't mind the 3 numbers on the back and the expiry date, please. And it's sort of, it's a bit crazy. And I think that, you know, the technology is there to solve that. And we had sort of fairly comic scenes in the Swedish, iZettle is a Swedish company, and so there's a strong engineering security conscience. And explaining to them that, well, our merchants actually want to have this feature where they can type in the card details and the expiry date and the thing. It was just like, they didn't understand. Like, how is this? We've been working to prevent this problem. So I think there are solutions not to do that. And actually what we do now is enable you to send a link so that the consumer can fill in their card details without giving them to you in real time. But there's tons of stuff like that, and it's such a good example of the chasm of sophistication that does exist and the kind of practices that still carry on if you don't elect to make the change.
Nice. Yep. Well, we're almost out of time, so I think I'll open the floor for any questions that anyone has. But yeah.
Good afternoon. John Sibbury from Streva Hotels and also SDK Consulting. I guess your model of business is virtually all customer-present transactions. I wanted to know if you've had any thoughts or if you've come up with a magical solution for the new Payment Services Directive coming into force next year, the, forgive me if I get this wrong, RTS on SCA 2, something like that, which is going to make life really difficult for us in the hotel business.
You said, was that directed to?
I'm hoping it's directed
whichever
to you.
one has the solution.
It's relevant to both of us, but you said our business is built on card present, so I assumed he was directing it to you. But
My word, I actually have to confess, I don't know exactly what the question is.
Yeah.
Maybe you can educate me, and then we
So PSD2, Payment Services Directive number 2, which is the kind of the new European standard for lots of different things, and the particular dimension of it that the gentleman mentioned was SCA, strong customer authentication. So how do we make sure that the person that is paying is actually a real person? So it's an extra layer of validation on top of just the fact they've got the payment instrument itself. It's controversial. It basically has the potential to add friction to conversion and checkout flows and so on, irrespective of whether it's going to be online or offline. I think at its heart, it's a consumer protection mechanism, and that's good. The devil is always in the detail of how it's implemented, and some of the considerations are, well, what should the monetary threshold be, and under what circumstances or what exemptions should be enabled so that you don't have to ask the consumer for that second bit of identifying information, because there's some challenges in there. It's a big topic. We could talk about it for a long time. Companies like ours, are actively kind of lobbying, policy makers around it so that we make sure that we don't overcorrect, on what is important to everybody.
I think one of the things about this, and I actually think that a lot of the recent regulation has just been actually incredible for the future that companies like all of us basically have to actually build, because I technically actually think that it's a really good thing to authenticate the customer, and anything that you can do which is good for authentication should be good for privacy. And I think that's why it's so exciting to hear about what Maxim's doing with Winding Tree or some of the new blockchain companies to think about basically identity and storing of identity and payment by identity basically as well. And I think all of those things, from a technological point of view, it's hard, but from a moral point of view, it seems to be right. The idea that the thing that Maxim was talking about on the panel, I thought was really, really good. It's just, the idea that you have to go to a silo and request that information is going to be deleted, that just seems, you're asking somebody for permission to delete that data. And I think especially now that us as technology companies are getting really kind of okay with the terms of what it means to be a data controller or a data processor, I think it also comes back to the OTA question, you know, and Booking.com being a data controller of the data that they're then providing you, that the customer has essentially, you know, you could have a debate whether they wanted to provide that to Booking or actually directly to you, because ultimately you're the guarantor of that privacy. And I think those types of questions are really, really interesting, and that's going to stimulate a lot of interesting debate and a lot of interesting innovation as well.
But at the same time, we need to go for lunch. So,
Just like that.
Thank you guys for your panel. I think the most important is to remember this equation. So free equals dollars. So.